Welcome to the Great Humbling Podcast. I'm Dougal Tyne, and since 2020 I've been recording these conversations with my friend Ed Gillespie. We start where our work meets and the places it takes us, the things that we're reading, the things that are getting us thinking, circling around the thought that these times in which we're living might be a humbling, a time of being brought down to earth and changed by the impact. Thank you for listening.
Yes, this meeting is being recorded and analysed, and all the data will be kept and used against you when the singularity hits.
Should we just go, Ed, from here?
Like, yeah, that's probably not a bad place to start. How the hell are you?
Oh, I am well. Spring is creeping in, and 20 minutes ago I finished a mammoth chapter on George Monbiot and Chris Smage and all of that stuff for the new book, which I've been living with this chapter for the last 10 days, and it's been disrupting my sleep. In
a good way?
Well, partly I'm just at the stage in writing a book where you go so far, somewhere between a third and a halfway through the word count, I think this kicks in. I think Susan Sontag says something about it somewhere. But basically, up to a certain point, it's like you're pushing the book up a hill. And then at a certain point, it's like a slow motion roller coaster because the book starts to pull you. So part of what's going on is that I've just hit that stage in writing the new book. And so Anna looks at me across the table and she's like, "You're not really here, are you? You're in the book." And so I spent Saturday night while the rest of the family were watching Sweden choose its Eurovision entry. I was sat down here in the dark in the shoe shop carrying on with it. So it's partly that, and it's partly really trying to lean in. I mean, we did a whole episode around this further back in time, everything that went on around Regenesis, revisiting all of that, reading into it as hard as I could, sensing into it, trying to do justice to everybody involved, whilst knowing that it's quite possible that my profit of it will be that the next time George decides to unleash a 5,500 word ultra polemical essay calling somebody a genocidal romantic, it'll be about me rather than about Chris. So that's tomorrow I get to sit down and type it up and edit it up, and there's a whole journey between here and what ends up on the page in the book.
Those were two words I wasn't expecting to kick off the podcast with, which was genocidal romantic.
Oh, well, you haven't been reading enough of George's recent help.
Yeah, oh my God. So what you're saying, basically, the process of book writing goes from being sort of a Sisyphean task,
yes,
pushing it uphill, and then it turns into one of those downhill mountain bike videos that pop up on the internet where you're completely out of control and going down staircases.
Yeah, pretty much. That's about the size of it, Ed. Another 2 months, I should come out the end of the mountain, hopefully not with too many parts broken. But yeah, that's where I am.
How does it feel?
Yeah, I mean, it feels. Yeah, gosh, there are so many things that we could be talking about. There are things we are going to talk about. But Ed, I want to know, how are you? What are you up to?
I'm good. I'm also feeling the joys of spring. I've just been for a very murky, misty and quite mysterious walk across the marsh. You know, it's one of those very close, cool spring mornings, but it's quite foggy out there, which always adds a different kind of vibe to the landscape. So I'm feeling like I'm holding everything quite close, even though the spring buds are all out, and you can feel that beyond Imbolc moment of flourishing is about to come. But I mean, this is relevant, I guess, because I have finally thrown my hat into the ring of local politics. And further to our previous discussions about the Green Wave and Zach Polanski, I am now standing as a county councillor in South Norfolk in the ward of East Depwade. So in the local elections coming up in May. So I've just been filling out my nomination form. I've done my first bit of canvassing, had the photographs taken for the first leaflet. And a lot of this is motivated by the encroaching darkness as well. I read Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny, which is a very short book, which he wrote, I think, in 2017 during the first Trump administration. And he's a historian, obviously, and the book is 20 lessons from the 20th century that we would do well to heed, not least because it sort of describes how so-called civilized societies, broke down into narcissism, fascism, and communism. And it was a really sobering read. And one of the chapters in the book has a kind of action at the end of it, which is stand for office. And I read the book and I thought, oh, bloody hell, I'm going to have to do it, aren't I? So, yeah, I'm doing that. And so that's going to be preoccupying me a lot for the next month or two. But it feels like the right thing to do. And I'm doing it principally because I don't want to see reform get in and running our local services or running them into the ground further.
Well, good for you. I mean, I was thinking about it. It was October when we recorded our last episode, and there was a bit in there where we were talking about, the fact that reform had been able to leapfrog the Tories and lead the polls for months and months at that point actually created the conditions for what has now actually happened and the Greens to leapfrog Labour. And I think the phrase that's been coming to me in a lot of conversations, obviously I talked to a lot of friends back in the UK, a lot of friends of this podcast around what's happening with this green wave. There's a phrase that keeps coming back to me: we're better than this. And I think that actually that's the sort of power source of what's going on. If you look at Gordon and Denton, the by-election that was this kind of critical breakthrough.
Hannah the plumber. Go Hannah the plumber.
Yeah, there we go. There's just the brokenness. It's like, okay, the populist right, whatever we want to call them, broke through the rupture of the failure of the systems inherited from the 20th century a decade ago, and created the one vehicle with momentum in our games of politics around that. Now, you could say, speaking of momentum, that Jeremy Corbyn did something similar within the Labour Party, but I don't think you can do that within the Labour Party, because I think it just gets bogged down in all of the baggage of that, including the baggage of the sort of reaction against that that's the basis of the regime that you've currently got in the UK, but also including the baggage that Corbyn and those around him had of the household gods of the old left and the ugly habits formed in a different time that congregate around that end of the left. And I was reading a few weeks ago, Anthea Lawson, another friend of this podcast, who's now on Substack, had a great post where she was talking about her and other women going out on a Saturday afternoon on their local high street and just asking people questions and getting into conversations and saying, like, we think our politics is broken. We think we need something better. What do you think? And it feels like, well, I'll tell you, the other thing that's come back to me in the past few weeks is I suddenly remember 10 years ago, it must be about 10 years ago this month, because I can remember it was, I was in Copenhagen. I was walking around the courtyard of the Parliament in Copenhagen with Caroline Lucas, who I don't particularly know, but we were both at this really interesting gathering brought together by Uffe Elbæk, the founder of the Chaos Pilots, who at that stage had gone into Parliament with a party called The Alternative. And he brought together this strange gathering. So there was Caroline was there, There was an MP from the Five Star Movement in Italy. There
Mm.
was there must have been somebody who was connected to the municipalism movement in Spain. I'm sure there was somebody from the Icelandic Pirate Party. And I came away from it, and for a few weeks, and then the Brexit vote happened. But for a few weeks, I was really seriously thinking about writing a sort of short book, which was trying to remap politics and saying, well, we've got these two axes. The one axis is the axis of, on the one side, there is no alternative, neoliberal realism, which is where all of the traditional parties had ended up. And so then you've got, no, there is an alternative.
Mm.
So that's an assertion. Then you've got another axis, which is the politics of fear and hate, where the alternative is by blaming and dealing with them, the bad people who tend to be the weakest people in society. And you've got parties that are on the other side of that axis. And I was like, so there are two sources of hope within the map this gives you. There were the sort of the renewed left that Corbynism was embodying, and there was the sort of the thing that most interested me was the non-leftist anti-neoliberalism, which I felt was what was represented at that meeting in Copenhagen. And I say non-leftist in the specific sense that it's not hung up on, it's not kind of infatuated with the dreams and the rights and the songs and the banners of the old left. And there's a freedom in that. There's a possibility to actually engage with where we find ourselves now, rather than it all turn nostalgic and always be focused on treating history as if it's a battle reenactment of the 1930s or whatever. And I suppose that would be my hope for what's happening with the Greens in the UK, is that it doesn't fall into the trap of going, we're the left now, but that it actually consolidates around we're better than this. We're better than what Nigel Farage is trying to sell you. We get why we get why everybody's fed up. There was that thing that came out from More in Common last week where like the majority of people in the UK say that the cost of living crisis is never going to end. True. Now, this is going to be tricky for the Greens because you can end up with a sort of left populist promise that if we just tax the billionaires, we can resurrect a benign social democratic settlement. Whereas we're really past that. We're in a degrowth reality.
Yeah. And I think,
yes, sorry, you go for it, Ed. You do the party political broadcast.
Well, but I think you're right. I think it has to be about that hope, but that hope has to be grounded in the practical reality. As you say, the cost of living crisis won't ease in any radical way just by doing a bit of wealth redistribution. It's much more complicated and systematically difficult beyond that. I mean, I think partly it's to do with, certainly my experience of canvassing is, that doorstep therapy, actually people being heard and listened to for perhaps the first time. When actually you're giving them your ear and being prepared to take their issues on board. I think it's also, there's a complexity because people always focus on national issues, whereas, with the best will in the world, I'm talking about local services. I'm talking about the reality of rural public transport, flooding, social care, empty shops. Those kind of things are very much the grist to the mill in the local level I'm standing. But I think what Hannah Spencer has also done a really good job of tapping into is that belief, as you articulated, that we are better than this, that there has to be a better way, that it can't always be about pointing and shouting at someone else for being responsible. And I think it's also, even since we last spoke, I've referred to the kind of Labour government as like a bleak piece of performance art where we're given any and every opportunity to do like the most tortuously wrong-headed thing, they seem to grab it with both hands. And I do think the creeping authoritarianism is really disturbing.
Yes.
You know, they've carried on the clampdown against climate activism and climate protesters. You know, we've had the Filton 24, the first group of the Filton 24 Palestine Action protesters now with a hung jury and found not guilty of the serious charges of aggravated burglary, which were preposterous in the first place. Those charges should never have been levied. You know, you've had the judicial review on Palestine Action where Shabana Mahmood could have used that as a way of stepping it down, de-escalating it, rationalizing it, and moving on. And instead we're stuck in this limbo of appeal.
Yeah.
And now the threat to trial by jury, where, you know, we've had 20 cases of climate protesters that have been found not guilty or had a hung jury since 2019.
Yes.
And there's a reason for that, because a kind of informed representative group of a jury of your peers look at these charges against these protesters, look at the reality of what they're experiencing in the wider world, and say, these people are honourable, or they're certainly not guilty of the punitive criminal charges you want to string them up with. And without that, you know, centuries long held belief in the importance of juries, you know, these type of protesters would end up in front of a judge, you know, who would say, no lawful excuse, hit the gavel, 3 years in prison, so, you know, and lock them up straight away.
This is also part of the story of We're Better Than This. Juries are part of the story of We're Better Than This.
Absolutely.
Citizens' assemblies are part of the story of We're Better Than This. And they're the experiments like flat pack democracy. You know, this to me is, I guess, you know, again, going back to the Corbyn era, one of the challenges there, and I remember some discussion around this at the time of the 2019 election, was, you know, a kind of left Labour desire to try to you know, fix these big issues from above, from Westminster. Yeah. And I actually think, you know, the most interesting people around the Labour Party, whether it's Andy Burnham or Clive Lewis, are very tuned into the inadequacy of that and actually the need for a radical democracy approach, including a transformation of the role of local government in the UK. But I mean, we sit around the table here in Sweden and talk about very similar issues, although there's not any equivalent kind of prison breakout from the prison of neoliberal realism or the ugly gangs of the far right going on in our politics just yet. We're talking about, well, what would that look like? But what we do have a lot of conversations about here are the brokenism. You know, the thing that you've probably heard, I'm sure I've talked about it on the podcast before, Alana Newhouse's articles about, you know, the great political divide now is between those who see existing systems and structures as broken beyond repair and those who think they can be patched up and made fit for purpose. And in a way, I think what the current Labour government in the UK has done is it's brought the status quoist side of that divide to a kind of reductio ad absurdum. It's basically succeeded in winning the argument for brokenism. And so you have two flavours of brokenism. I've noticed Farage is using the word broken a lot. He says, we're not the same as Tories and Labour because we think Britain's broken. Now, I mean, David Cameron was saying that in 2008, but it matters that, you know, the argument has been won one way or the other. The existing system is broken beyond fixing. But what happens next? Well, the We're Better Than This story of what happens next is we have to get together around the table and fix it. And there has to be, you know, and in practice, we have to find ways of making good lives under conditions where the promise of economic progress as it used to exist is long gone. It's not even part of the experience of the lives of people 10 or 20 years younger than us. And so making a politics for a world where that's just not where things are headed. The interesting thing is this this is also part of how AI is playing out. The other thing that really struck me last week was reading a piece about the big shift in what young people, and I think this was in the US, are focusing on and training in. And there's a big move of people training in the manual trades because suddenly it's obvious that actually, the jobs that AI is eating and going to eat are all of the bullshit jobs that David Graeber was writing about.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what's left is skills working with your hands, working with what James Scott would call metis, the kind of knowledge that's hard to put into words, hard to teach through a set of instructions, that's actually acquired and held in practice. And I suddenly, when I saw that, I realized in a weird way, AI is working to contribute to the conditions for what's actually going to be needed in any case, which is this kind of path towards becoming people who are competent, becoming people who are capable of fixing things and making life work together. Because the first move in that direction is a revaluing of those kinds of skills.
No, I totally agree. And it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, these things are often cyclical, aren't they? I remember in the last episode, you asked me, you asked the rhetorical question, the Gordon White phrasing of where are we in the timeline?
Yeah.
Where are we in the timeline? And actually, I was rereading a bit of Animistic last week when, he's in Pohnpei in the Pacific. And there's a saying there, which is, I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's like Kailan Io, which basically means the other side of yesterday. And he said, in the meaning of that, it's like it's both further away from us than yesterday, but it's also today. So the other side of yesterday is also today, as well as being in the past. And the things that then happen, the other side of yesterday, are the sort of things that are always happening, and the sort of things whose happenings shape reality. And as you say, there's a sort of timelessness to those skills, which is being driven by AI because they're the things which aren't replaceable. And one of the most powerful things I've watched recently is our old friend Indy Johar and his lecture for the Long Now Foundation. I don't know if you've seen that yet.
I haven't seen that.
No, it's really good. I mean, it's very indie. It's called civilizational optioneering. In terms of like his masterful approach. I mean, it's a big talk, but I mean, he says right at the end of that something along the lines of we need to move beyond this sort of valorization of opinion and rediscover conversation, which is talking to each other again and listening and getting back into that practice and that space. But the bit that really struck me, which brings these two bits and pieces together, the kind of the hands-on work and the AI and machine learning, because I mean, it's a beautiful lecture, I would also say. He cites something from Lovelock, which I hadn't picked up on, but in Lovelock's last book, Novacene, Lovelock apparently describes that 1968 photo, Earthrise, the iconic environmental one that everyone talked about. But he said, that's the moment that the planet became self-aware, had to use billions of years of fossilized sunshine to take a photo of itself. Which is like, and that actually obviously required, an enormous input, cultivating all of this energy in order to twang someone into space and take that picture. But that depended on a combination of what Lovelock described as all natural systems, both technological and biological. And it is about the bringing of those two things together. And Indy, in quite a sort of challenging provocation, said, and this is probably playing to some of your work with around Smage and Monbiot and the tensions that exist within that. But we know that like terraforming and terraforming stuff, like terra preta, the dark, Amazonian soil that leads to that fecundity of a rainforest, is made by humans, and it was made by humans over millennia through the biochar and the ways that those people farmed. And indie offers this sort of tantalizing moment where, like, can we combine the insights and the analysis of AI and machine learning with the principles of agroforestry to create something which is absolutely transformative and regenerative, but by including the multi-layered interdependencies and interconnectedness of the species relationships that requires. So it's not the precision fermentation in the lab of Monbio, but and it's also not necessarily just the smallholder farming of smage. It's a tantalizing possibility of something else in between, and it really struck me. And going, that's a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably know what my reaction to it is going to be, which is, why do we need to? I don't. I'm not willing to credit things like LLMs with a kind of equal status or a progress narrative agency. I find, frankly, the piece that John Michael Greer put out last week, where he says, I think I've realized what's actually happening with the LLMs, which is that they're a way of cannibalizing the unsustainable bureaucratic bullshit jobs layer of our social structure, so as to make possible, without anyone having to admit that it's what's happening, the kind of simplification that is part of what he years and years and years ago described as the catabolic theory mode of collapse. Now, I mean, there's a lot in there that would sort of need unpacking. I'd say, just if you're curious, go and look at it. We'll stick the links in there. But the other thing that I read, I guess, since our last episode, that might be a kind of peace offering to this attempt to find these syntheses is an extraordinary piece. I'm not going to remember the title of it now, but the guy who wrote it writes under the name of John N. Corston on Substack. And he basically, he did this piece that was about how to actually conquer the stars by working with flows rather than stocks. And so, instead of focusing on Mars, you're focusing on Venus and you're focusing on Jupiter and these kind of apparently inhospitable chemical environments. But what's brilliant about it is, and it says, and the only way you get to this is it takes about 400 years. We can't get there at the kind of timeline that Musk and so on have been promising. And if you read it carefully, what you realize is that he is constructing a scenario in which those who are invested in the belief system of going to the stars and those who are on a kind of Chris Smage small farm future path both need the same things to happen in the next 100 years.
It's a long now perspective.
Actually, that's a point. We should make sure that the long now folks have that on their radar. I thought it was the most fascinating piece. I mean, I sent it around to a few people, basically the people who I thought were kind of the polar opposites around this. So like Vinay Gupta on one side and Ashley from Doomer Optimism on the other side, and goes, like, guys, can't you see this is like the sort of impossible overlap Venn diagram, everyone on the same team thing, which I think is the same move that Indy, it sounds like, is trying to make. So yeah, that would be my kind of offering to that piece of narration of trying to find the common ground.
Yeah, and I totally get that. Why do we have to? I also understand that piece as well. I mean, the other bit that Indy referenced in the talk that again made me go back and go, why didn't I know that? Was he referenced Descartes, and everyone knows, cogito ergo sum. Mm-hmm. But I didn't realize, do you know that's not the whole quote?
Remind me.
The whole quote is dubito ergo cogito ergo sum, which is I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. Now, isn't that one of those great historical examples of something going, why the fuck didn't I know that the first part of that quote is I doubt? And and the embracing of uncertainty, and partial knowing, and the invitation of curiosity that comes from that. And I've also been spending a bit of time with Sam Conniff. Sam has been lecturing and doing his uncertainty piece with the Forward Institute on a couple of our residentials. And I also just interviewed him on the Future Noughts podcast, along with Catherine, his wife, and intellectual business partner, and and mother of their beautiful child, Elvis.
Elvis lives.
Elvis lives, exactly. He's not left the building. He's now embracing uncertainty, which he will. Can you imagine having those two as parents who go, "Are you sure about that, Elvis? Are you sure about that?" It's going to be quite an upbringing. But I thought it was really powerful, the fact that we seem to have that confidence in that kind of phrase. I think, therefore I am. But actually, the precedent and the foundation, the first part of it, the prefix, if you like, is I doubt, and that's where all the power is.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and have a proper look at Descartes, because like most of us, I know the famous phrase, but I'd never read Descartes. But I don't want us to miss the opportunity to give a shout out to Sam's fantastic post the other day about street parties.
Yeah,
and why it makes sense to be organizing a street party at the end of the world. Was what I would have titled that post as, and it was great. And I believe that there's even like a WhatsApp group that you can join where people are supporting each other to organize their own street parties that Sam links to at the end of the post. So yeah,
well, there is, and I need to get Sam co-promoting, because I'm involved with something which is called the Big Lunch.
Of course you are.
Which is
Tim Smith.
And it's Tim Smith, exactly. So Tim Smith started the Big Lunch Out of Eden project. I mean, I think at least a decade ago now. They have 10 million people every year in the UK who come to one of those big lunches in June. So, they're they are like Sam's street party. And I've been working with them to help them frame and position the Big Lunch in the context of the politics in which we find ourselves. And obviously things like the Big Lunch are very small p political, but they are the antidote to polarize, as Sam was articulating brilliantly in that post. They're the antidote to polarization and separation and divisionism. And I had to remind the organizers of the Big Lunch where the word company came from, which is whom you break bread with, which we've talked about on this podcast before. But to be in good company is literally about the people you break the bread with. And so, we've been conjuring up some really great creative ideas of how you can do this in a way which is really building bridges and fostering inclusivity and doing some of that community repair work that's required in the real world because of the feisty, febrile, divisive context of our online lives.
Right. And Sam actually linked to an episode of the Uncertainty Experts podcast that he and Catherine had done where they interviewed Tim Smith. So that was linked from his street party post. And I listened to it. And it was great. It had some really provocative bits in a similar way to Indy's talk, no doubt. But one of the bits I took
Tim
from
Tim Smith provocative?
I know.
I'd have thunk it.
But the one of the bits I loved was when he goes, look, the Big Lunch is just an excuse. Because it's really scary and weird to ask your neighbour, would you like to come round for lunch? But to go, we're doing a big lunch. It's the thing that Caroline Ross always talks about, of using the false to cultivate the real, creating a pretext, the MacGuffin in the Hitchcock movie. There was also another great post that I want to mention called Wednesday Night Pizza Club. Did you see that one?
No.
It's these two guys writing about 8 years of work that they've done that sort of started out, I think, in kind of almost in a policy space, thinking about loneliness, isolation, the social costs of it, bowling alone, Putnam, all of that stuff. And so they're then going, so we want to try doing things at community level. And they did this thing where they were like, right, we've got this pot of money. We'll give out $150 grants for you to organize a meaningful gathering. And they put together a website and they sent this out to like 50 people, friends and family. Tumbleweed. No one picked up on it. And then in the post, they're like, then we realized, we started unpicking it. We realized using language like meaningful gathering was shooting ourselves in the foot. It was upping the stakes, making it weird and scary for people. And they experimented and they came up with instead Wednesday night pizza club. And you can sign up and they'll give you $50 for the first Wednesday night. And you can invite a bunch of neighbors over and go, we got money to get free pizza. Do you want to come and help me eat it? It's the same thing, you know, and I love that. I love when we find these things that have the kind of pattern language quality to them. It's not rocket science. And that's like the best side of Tim Smith's work is that kind of, it's not rocket science. Get the bullshit experts out of the way and let's do something that works and spread it like a rumor or a joke. That I'm really on board for.
Yeah, and there's another gathering which is similar to the pizza one that I've been to a couple of times, which is started by a guy called Adam Bastock here, which is a People Planet Pint, which I guess has a little bit of the meaningful gathering edge to it, but it's kind of like the 2026 successor to Green Drinks, you know, which we used to have back in the day. But the joyous part of that is, you know, they managed to get a kind of an enlightened sponsor for it. So, you know, the first 50 people who rock up, I think, get a free drink. So, you know, it's a massive incentive. But again, it's no agenda. It's just hanging out with folks. And I love the sort of unstructured freedom of that. Just come along and meet cool people.
Yeah. Oh, there's a great example that I came across while I was working on this chapter. It's in James Scott's. This is a classic. Have we ever talked about this book on the podcast?
I don't think we have. Seeing Like a State.
Seeing Like a State, James C. Scott. It's such a classic. And there's a bit where he's got this thing of, you know, metis, which is this other kind of knowledge. It's know-how, not in the sense of knowing how it works, but knowing how to be a part of a process that works. And he talks about this 19th century French phenomenon, which is called, let me find it. It's vieille. My French is rubbish. It's basically a thing on winter evenings where everyone gathers. Here it is. Right. Veillée of 19th century France. The veillée, as its name implies, if you know French, was a traditional pattern of gathering practiced by farm families during winter evenings, often in barns, to take advantage of the warmth generated by the livestock and thus save on fuel. With no agenda save sociability and economy, the gatherings amounted to local assemblies where opinions, stories, agricultural news, advice, gossip, and religious or folk tales were exchanged, while the participants shelled nuts or embroidered. Given the fact that each member there possessed a lifetime of interested observation and practice, in which every family paid for the consequences of its agricultural decisions, the veillée was an unheralded daily seminar on practical knowledge. I love that. I want to pick that out in stitching and put it on the wall of the shoe shop. That's the future. That's a world worth living for me, and it's already existed. It's there, and you know, if we're lucky, we get to take with us some things that they didn't have in the time of the veillées in 19th century France out of these end times of modernity that are really worth taking with us. But we also have to recover practices like that. We have to have spaces in which that kind of knowledge sharing goes on, and that's, you know, this is the stuff that I'm trying to write about and trying to work for.
Yeah, and I guess the challenge then is pitching it, isn't it? Which doesn't sound in that worthy sense. You know, it often brings me back. I often think of pubs. You know, I always go back to that kind of.
I often think of pubs too, Ed. It's one of the things I miss not living in England.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very blessed in the village where I live, because we've got 4 pubs, and they each cater to like slightly different tastes and clientels, but they all have that conviviality. I'm sure, even if it's not as formal as or informal as a VA, where people are sharing stuff, there's definitely the connections and the cohesion within the village, and the threads of the village are woven together in those establishments.
Yes.
Or the post office queue, which is shorter these days because no one ever sends a thing by post.
Yeah, apart from me, but yes. No, actually, I have had handwritten letters through the post in recent times. I got a 13-page letter from a high school student in Massachusetts, and I got a lovely short letter from a teacher in Montana who had collected all but one of the back issues of Dark Mountain and wanted to know if I had a clue where she could get the last one. And what strikes me as well, I had another letter that was written on a typewriter, all of them from people who I would guess are probably under 30. So there is a kind of like a backwash, another current moving against the main current of the direction that things are going, that, in certain ways is going to gain surprising momentum. I don't know whether that will end up being part of it, but
No,
it's a straw in the wind.
exactly, and it just shows that there is that underlying appetite for it, as is proven by the fact that 10 million people will rock up for the big lunch, and want that desire. It's having the invitation and the permission to step into that space. I mean, on a slightly different note, but not entirely unconnected, I'm also about to go off on writing retreat again. So Jonathan Gosling and I are hosting the next of our writing retreats, which you might like this one because this is the first time we've actually themed it. And so we're going to a place called Muncaster Castle in the Lake District, which is the home of the original Tom Fool.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so it's where we get the word tomfoolery from, and the wise fool. And so we've cooked up a writing retreat which is called Led by Fools, where we're going to be exploring the trickster and the role of the wise fool and the jester and the mischievous playfulness and the darkness of that trickster archetype. We've got John Elkington as a special guest, and we've got 25 writers joining us for 4 or 5 days of medieval inspired messing around.
Cool. Oh, well, say hi to John from me. I don't know if he'll remember me, but we met way back in the day when I was doing School of Everything with Paul Miller and Mary Harrington and Andy Gibson and Pete Brownell, and 2 or 3 of us went for a meeting with him, and I thought he was a wonderful man. But since you're, of course, working with Trickster and Fool, the other thing I should say about this Metis business, Metis is also the description of Odysseus. It's the literal translation of Metis from Greek into English is cunning, but you could also say crafty, which brings us the connection to the skills that lie in the hands, but it's also the connection to Trickster. So all of this is going to be in my book, but I know it's one of the places where the stuff that we're working on meets. So that felt worth dropping in. Ed, I want to say we've done this episode backwards because we just dived straight into the thick of things. But before we wrap it up, I want to know what else you've been reading and listening to. What do you want to share with our fellow humblers?
Yeah, I mean, I will just endorse Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny again. I mean,
Right.
I think people should definitely read that. I have to confess, Dougal, I think given the heaviness and the weight of a lot of what is going on externally, I have indulged myself in a little bit of magical realistic escapism. I never got round to reading Pullman's Book of Dust.
Oh, yes.
So having read the first 3, I am now belatedly halfway through Book of Dust Part 1.
Okay. Are you enjoying it?
I'm loving it. And I think at the end of a long day, when you've been wrangling with all sorts of other intense things, to step into Pullman's world is so liberating and so beautiful. Even though there are obviously darknesses and complexities within it. It's just an imagination of the fact that we can be better than this,
Yeah.
and we could be better than this.
Yeah, I don't think there's any shame in that at all, Ed. I think
No.
there's some lovely stuff in the final volume. There's some lovely stuff around imagination
Yeah.
that I really enjoyed. So you've got that to look forward to. Speaking of the imagination and the other, I must remember to give a shout out for a collaboration between two friends of this podcast who it was very interesting to realize they're now working together. So you must know Remus Staines.
Well, yes,
Yes, you know.
the amazing artist. I have bought one of her beautiful paintings called The Storyteller, which is on my daughter's bedroom wall. Which is,
Oh,
of the beautiful old woman with the kids sat around in a circle and telling the stories, and there's all these kind of symbolic images pouring forth. And yeah, I find her work exquisite.
fabulous. Well, we have a couple of her paintings in our bedroom as well. And I got out the one of my favorite all-time Dark Mountain covers. There was the second issue of Dark Mountain that Rima did. But so you never guess who Rima is working with. She's working with Danny Nemu.
Really?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Of Neuro Apocalypse. And they
Wow.
together, it's clearly the time of the hypnotherapists, isn't it? Between Zach and, Danny's a hypnotherapist as well. But so Danny and Rima are collaborating on this project called Between, which you can find at b-tween.art. And it's an experimental evocation of altered states, combining visual art, poetry, and hypnosis. And I can't imagine that okay, I always think the work that's worth celebrating is when you see people doing something and you go, nobody else could be doing
Nobody
this.
else could be doing that.
And it's even better when it's like a combination of really rare individuals together doing something. It's like nobody else could be doing this squared. So yeah, definitely. I suspect that quite a few of our listeners would enjoy checking out what those two are up to. Have you read, speaking of friends of the podcast, have you read Liturgies of the Wild yet?
I haven't read Liturgies of the Wild yet. I must admit, I have. This is a terrible confession, but I've followed less of Martin's stuff since his divine conversion, which is awful because I'm sure it's just as brilliant as it was before. But no, I haven't read Liturgies of the Wild.
Well,
Yet.
that gives me a good cue because I wanted to say about it because I have read it. And before I read it, I had sort of reshared my old essay written way back when he'd only published 2 books as opposed to like 700 or however many Martin has published by now. But I shared the sort of review essay that I wrote about the first 2 volumes of the Myth Teller trilogy. And somebody who read that clicked through to the page for Liturgies of the Wild and went, oh, I don't think I want to read this because it's like the blurb on the website sort of made it sound as if due to his conversion, it's all now about the one true story. That's really not how Liturgies of the Wild comes across. It's really not a book that you're only going to enjoy if you're a Christian or Christian friendly. It does. I think it will give people a how do I want to say this? If you're genuinely curious how Martin, with all of the things from his earlier work that you've appreciated, lands and reconfigures within the ground of Christianity, it'll give you part of the answer. But the answer it'll give you is what I've heard Martin say. He said this to me like 2 or 3 years ago. He said, I've been really surprised at how little of what has mattered to me and what I've given my life and my work to, I've had to let go of. And actually what came through to me reading the book is the only thing that's changed as a consequence for him is he holds himself to a higher standard in his behavior as a human being. And all of the stories are still welcome. All of, as he would say, all of the small gods are still welcome. All of the richness of the myth world is still there. He's now I know that some people just can't go there and can't swallow it, but I'm sort of here to say that don't don't be put off by the publisher's blurb for Liturgies of the Wild. It's a classic. Martin Shaw at his most accessible, because his books range from the very esoteric, the ones that are real technical books like Wolf's Milk, that's really for people who are actually doing the work of taking people out onto the land and working with initiation, to the books like the two that he wrote for Chelsea Green that I've sometimes called kind of Martin Shaw for beginners. And this isn't a for beginners book. This is more a kind of summation of 30 years of work for a wide audience, with all of the quality of production and editing that a big publisher is able to give to it. That's no diss to Chelsea Green, because I've just signed up with them again for my new book, and they do brilliant work. But there are certain things that a publisher like Penguin can bring to the table, and I see Martin sort of coming to the table and doing a book that is a kind of landmark within his work, and it's a book for everyone, not just for believers. So,
well, okay, you've inspired me. Then I mean, it wasn't a turning away from Martin. No. It just I hadn't got round to reading it in my Sundoku pile of tomes to plow through. I mean, on that, when you said small gods, and the small gods are still there and welcome, it did remind me, and you might not have been able to get this in Sweden, but there's been a brilliant TV series here called Small Prophets by Mackenzie Crook, which is exactly that little slice of magical realism, and it's been hugely popular. But essentially, it's about a guy whose girlfriend has disappeared, and she vanishes on Christmas Eve, I think, and this is 7 years previously, and he sort of works in a DIY shop. But his father, who is played by Michael Palin, who is in a residential home, gives him the recipe for growing homunculi, like small godlike small golems, in jars that will be able to tell the truth and speak the future. And as a premise for what is actually in many senses a very gentle sitcom, it's such an unlikely thing to end up on TV. It's beautiful and brilliant. So you'll have to, when next time you're over, you'll just have to binge watch it on iPlayer.
I'll keep an eye out for if it comes here. But thanks for that. I'm going to wave one more book around, and then I'm going to give a plug for one or two things that are coming up. So this is another book that's to hand because it's on the pile that I've been using in the last couple of chapters that I've been writing. But this is The Subsistence Perspective by, it's Maria Mies in big letters and then Veronica Benholt Thompson in small letters because her name's much longer. But basically two of these German feminists who I've been learning more about this, partly for the writing of this book, and I realized that I want to go further into this story. It won't all fit into the book that I'm writing at the moment, so I'll write an essay around this when I've done the book. But basically there was this group that I've come to think of as the Bielefeld School in the 70s in Germany, around the University of Bielefeld, that Maria Mies, Veronica Benholt Thompson and various others were part of, who brought together questions and thinking that was going on within the women's movement in the global north with their experience as anthropologists and scholars of development, building connections with peasant movements in the global south, to ask these really radical questions about home and about gender and work. And every time I've found myself, with this book and with other things that came out of that group, finding my way to their work, and I've only begun to sort of understand better through this book the shape of the history of this work. It's like these women were laying the ground for things that they really influenced Ivan Illich, for example. I realized that Illich's most interesting work comes after he met Barbara Duden, who was another German feminist scholar who was connected to this circle, and started to read this work. And it really brought a new level to his work from the late 70s, early 80s onwards for me.
Trust the women always.
Yeah. I will probably, when I write an essay about that, we should do a whole episode where we talk more about this history, because I'm only just beginning to learn about it and being a bit humbled by realizing how far they were there ahead of lots of the things that you and I and people we talk to have been thinking about. So there's that. All right.
It's because it happened. It's because they all happened the other side of yesterday.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that phrase. That's great. The other side of yesterday. It'd be a great title for something as well, wouldn't it, Ed?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, two things coming up, starting in April, and I don't have the dates to hand, but a wonderful gang of people who I met because some of them were at the Rotterdam Change Days event where I gave the keynote whilst coming down with horrendous flu in November. But the whole event was around the theme of At Work in the Ruins.
Is it
And
a
a group,
shamanic flu?
I don't know, to be honest. It just felt like a fairly miserable one. But the miserable part was having to get back to Sweden by train with the flu at the end of when I should have been going to England to be with my parents and my sister because my mum was in hospital, but thankfully my mum's out of hospital and somewhat better. But yeah, so this gang are doing an online series called At Work in the Ruins, using the 4 tasks for an age of endings from the end of At Work in the Ruins. And they're going to have sort of 4 weeks around each of those tasks. And then in the 5th week, I'm going to join for the final session to listen to what's come up and have some discussion with everybody. So I'll stick the link to that in the show notes for today. And then at long last, and this gives me a deadline for finishing the book, never mind the deadline that Chelsea Green have given me, 21st and 22nd of May, Anna and I are going to start a new online series, the first one since the autumn of 2024. And we're calling it A Bit More Practice. So this is Regrowing a Living Culture, A Bit More Practice, a 5-week journey where we're going to be sharing some practices that you can try out yourself with those around you. It's partly practice in the sense of we know that most of us who get together through these things are in relatively sheltered and relatively privileged conditions. And we also know that nobody and no place is protected against the kinds of unraveling that are unfolding. And so part of practicing is building the muscles, building the capacity with the people around you in the places where you are to show up when it comes to you, because one way or another it will. And part of practice as well is that virtue ethics sense of, we become what we practice. How we respond when we find ourselves in unexpected and extreme situations is not shaped by a decision we make in the moment. It's shaped by the choices and the practices we've been making during the quiet seasons of life over the years and decades that precede that moment where you find yourself having to make one of the big choices of your life. So it's all about practice. That's where we're gathering this spring, and that will all be on the a school called home.org.
I love the title.
Put this episode live. Thanks.
Yeah. Sign me up.
Cool. Well, how about you? What have you got coming up? Is there anything you want to mention to people? Anything that you want to trail at this stage in proceedings?
Well, no, as I say, by the time we next meet, I will have been led by fools at Muncaster. I will have gone through a local election process and may or may not be a county councillor.
Wow.
But in terms of other dates, I mean, we have another writing retreat coming up on Lambay Island off the coast of Ireland in September, if people wish to join, and I'll send a link so you can pop it in the show notes. But that is also, if people want an island experience, which is an island, as I think I've mentioned before, which is populated by wallabies, it is a beautiful and brilliant place to go.
So there we go. We're led by fools and populated by wallabies. Those are the themes, and
thanks.
And maybe you will inspire a wave of like-minded souls to stand humbly for election. I hear that the Greens are looking for candidates to have a full slate to run across London to transform local government in London. So maybe there are some listeners who are inspired by your example. Other political parties are available. Make your choices wisely. Make your choices humbly. That's what I should have said, isn't it?
Thank you. Make your choices humbly.
Thanks for listening to the Great Humbling podcast. You can find more at our website, homewardbound.org, where you can also subscribe to us on Substack. We're on Facebook as The Great Humbling. Ed is, I believe, still on the site formerly known as Twitter as @Frucool. And if you'd like to spend more time with my work, then visit aschoolcalledhome.org and find out about the online series that we're hosting there. The title music for the podcast comes from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks again for listening.